12 men in black suits guarded her apartment. "You're under my protection," said the Mafia boss. "Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. It was late when Sarah finally made it home after another grueling shift at the diner. She had barely enough energy to turn the key in the door and stumble inside, the weight of the day's exhaustion sinking deep into her bones. The small apartment was dim, just a few lights from the street outside casting faint shadows across the room. She kicked off her shoes and dropped her bag, but something felt off. The air was heavier than usual, like it was thick with something she couldn't put her finger on. As she moved further into the living room, her eyes caught a glint of something outside the window. Her heart skipped a beat when she noticed a black SUV parked right outside her building. A chill ran down her spine, but she quickly brushed it off. It had been a tough week, and her mind was probably playing tricks on her. But just as she turned to head to the kitchen, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her sister, asking her to pick up some groceries on her way back from work. Sarah smiled at the normalcy of it, but just as she reached for the fridge, the sound of a heavy knock on the door made her freeze. She wasn't expecting anyone. Not at this hour. A quick glance out the peephole confirmed her worst fear. 2 men in dark suits stood in the hallway. One was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, his sharp eyes scanning the hallway with calculated precision. The other man was taller, standing straight and rigid, with an aura of authority that made the air feel even colder. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. Who were these men? She didn't recognize them, and yet something in her gut told her they weren't here for a friendly visit. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice that was calm, but firm. "Miss Anderson, we need to speak with you." The sound of her full name only made her more uneasy. She hadn't given anyone her information other than family and close friends. How did they know who she was? Panic threatened to take hold, but she held it in check, standing silently behind the door. She debated calling the police, but one look through the peephole told her it might be too late. "Open the door, Miss Anderson," came the voice again, sharper this time. "It's in your best interest." Sarah's mind raced. There was no way she was opening that door, but her hand hovered over the lock, her body frozen in place. The tension was unbearable, and for a moment, she thought she could feel the weight of their eyes even through the door. Then, without warning, the doorbell rang, loud and clear. Sarah jumped, nearly stumbling backward in shock. Before she could react, the door to her apartment was pushed open with alarming force. Standing there in the doorway, a tall, imposing man in a dark suit stepped inside, flanked by the 2 other men who had been outside. His presence filled the room instantly, like he commanded the very air around him. He was calm, but there was a chill in his eyes that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Don't be frightened, Miss Anderson," he said, his voice smooth, yet filled with an undercurrent of authority. "I'm here to keep you safe. You're under my protection now." Sarah's mind raced as she looked between the 3 men, their silent, intimidating stance making it impossible to ignore the danger she was in. She opened her mouth to speak, to demand answers, but the words caught in her throat. The man in front of her, he was no stranger to power, and the air around him felt like it belonged to someone who never took no for an answer. As the realization set in, Sarah's heart began to pound. She had no idea who these men were, but the Mafia boss in front of her made one thing clear. Her life would never be the same again. As Sarah stood there, stunned and unsure of what was happening, the man in the dark suit finally spoke again, his voice calm and measured. "You're under my protection now, Miss Anderson," he said, as if his words carried a weight that could not be ignored. He seemed to expect no resistance. The other 2 men flanked the door, their eyes scanning the apartment with a practiced ease, like they were used to situations like this. "Don't worry. You're safe here. Nothing will happen to you while we're around." Sarah's heart raced as she processed what was happening. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to find a way out of this, but her legs felt like lead. She had no idea who these men were or what they wanted with her. The man in the suit stepped forward, his presence towering over her. "My name is Alejandro Romano," he said, his eyes cold and calculating. And these are my associates. You will be safe under my watch. Sarah's mind raced. Romano. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place it. The room felt smaller as he continued speaking, his voice lowering. There are people who are looking for you. People who would hurt you if given the chance. I cannot let that happen. That is why I'm here. His words sent a chill through her body, and for a moment, Sarah wondered if she was about to be dragged into a world of danger she couldn't escape. I don't understand, she stammered, still trying to wrap her mind around the situation. Who are you? Why are you doing this? Romano gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Let's just say, I'm in a position to help you, and you don't have a choice in the matter. The bluntness of his statement hit her like a slap. Sarah's stomach twisted, and she instinctively took a step back. She wanted to say something, to demand answers, but the words caught in her throat. What could she possibly say to a man who was so certain of his control over her life? She glanced at the two men who had followed him inside. One was tall and muscular, his eyes never stopping their surveillance of the room. The other was older, with graying hair, his expression unreadable. They both exuded power, and their silent presence only made the situation feel more ominous. Romano took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. I know this is overwhelming, he said, his voice softer. Now, though still commanding. But you must understand, there are people who want to hurt you, and I can make sure that doesn't happen. Sarah felt her chest tighten. Who? Why me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Romano seemed to hesitate for a moment before responding. People from your past. People who you don't even realize are connected to you. People who will stop at nothing to get what they want. But that's where I come in. Sarah wanted to argue, to demand that he explain himself, but she was too tired, too scared. The weight of the situation was sinking in, and she realized that she had no control. Romano was right. She didn't have a choice. He was offering her protection, but at what cost? As if reading her thoughts, Romano added, I don't expect you to understand everything right away, but I will make sure you are safe. For now, that is all you need to know. Sarah swallowed hard, her hands trembling. She had no idea what kind of game he was playing, but she knew that refusing him might be worse. After all, these men weren't here because they were kind-hearted. They were here because they could afford to be ruthless. The thought sent a wave of unease through her, but there was nothing she could do. Romano turned and nodded to one of the men standing by the door. Take Miss Anderson's things. We're moving her somewhere safe. Sarah blinked in disbelief. What? No, I'm not going anywhere with you, she protested, her voice rising in panic. Romano turned back to her, his expression unreadable. You don't have a choice, he said simply. His tone left no room for argument. You will be safe with me, and you will learn to trust me. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to resist, to refuse, but as she looked into Romano's cold, unyielding eyes, she knew she was powerless. This wasn't a situation where she could simply walk away. This was a world she didn't understand, and she had no idea how deep it ran. The man who had just walked into her life, Alejandro Romano, was a force to be reckoned with, and for better or worse, she was now a part of it. As the men started to move around her, packing her things, she felt a surge of fear. The life she knew was slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. As Sarah sat silently in the back of the sleek black SUV, her heart was racing. The men in black suits flanked her on either side, their presence imposing and almost suffocating. Romano had said she was safe, but the more she thought about it, the less certain she felt. She had no idea where they were taking her, and every minute that passed only deepened the sense of dread gnawing at her stomach. She glanced out the window at the city passing by, her mind spinning with questions she had no answers to. Who were these men? What kind of trouble had she found herself in? And why had Romano taken such a sudden interest in her life? The SUV turned onto a narrow street, and her gaze shifted toward the building ahead. It was a large, gated estate, its walls towering and imposing. As the vehicle rolled through the gates, Sarah couldn't help but feel a chill crawl down her spine. She was being taken somewhere far beyond anything she had ever known. Romano had told her she was safe, but the fact that she was in a stranger's car, with no idea where she was headed, made her feel anything but safe. The car came to a stop in front of the grand entrance. and the door opened before Sarah could even think about getting out. One of the men in suits stepped out first, holding the door open for her. She hesitated for a moment, but knew there was no turning back now. She stepped out of the vehicle and onto the marble steps that led into the estate. Romano was already waiting at the door, his cold eyes watching her every move. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his gaze that made her stomach twist. "Welcome to my home," he said, his voice smooth and calm. "You'll be staying here for a while. For your protection." Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. How had her life come to this? Just days ago, she had been living a simple life, working at a diner and struggling to pay her bills. Now, she was being ushered into the home of a man who seemed to control everything. She had no idea what was going on, but she knew she had no choice but to follow his lead. Romano led her through the massive front doors, and she was immediately struck by the grandeur of the place. The high ceilings, the marble floors, the expensive furniture, it was all so foreign to her. She had never been in a house like this before, and the sight of it made her feel small and out of place. "This is where you'll be staying," Romano said, gesturing to a large room at the end of the hallway. "We'll make sure you have everything you need, but I'll be keeping a close eye on you." Sarah looked at him, her heart pounding. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice shaky. "What do you want from me?" Romano's eyes flickered for a moment before he replied, "You don't have to understand yet, Miss Anderson. Just know that I'm doing this because I'm the only one who can protect you." Sarah felt a wave of frustration flood over her. She didn't want his protection, not like this. She didn't want to be some pawn in his game. But she couldn't deny the fear that was creeping into her bones. Whatever he was involved in, whatever world he lived in, she wasn't ready to face it. And she certainly wasn't prepared to fight it. As she stood there, in the opulent foyer of Romano's estate, she realized just how deep she had fallen into his world. The reality of her situation was finally sinking in. She was trapped, and there was no escape. Romano was right about one thing. She was under his protection now, whether she wanted it or not. The next few days passed in a blur. Romano kept her close, always within his reach, always watching her. He made sure she had everything she needed: clothes, food, a comfortable place to sleep, but there was no room for freedom. She was constantly surrounded by his men, who never left her alone. The walls of the estate felt like they were closing in on her. Sarah had never felt so isolated in her life. She longed for the freedom she once had, but it was slipping farther and farther away with each passing hour. Romano's presence was a constant reminder of the life she had been dragged into. She couldn't escape, no matter how hard she tried. One night, as she sat alone in her room, she heard a knock at the door. Her heart skipped a beat as she rose to answer it. When she opened the door, she was greeted by one of Romano's men, a tall figure in a black suit. "Mr. Romano would like to see you," he said simply, his voice devoid of emotion. Sarah hesitated for a moment before following him down the hallway. Her mind raced with questions, but she had learned by now that Romano didn't answer questions. He only gave orders. She reached the room at the end of the hall and was ushered inside. Romano was standing by the window, his back turned to her as he stared out into the night. "I hope you're settling in," he said, his tone casual. "I know this isn't easy, but you'll get used to it." Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but before she could get a word out, he turned to face her. His eyes were cold, calculating, and for a moment, she felt a shiver run down her spine. "I'm doing what I have to, Miss Anderson," he said. "This isn't just about protecting you. It's about keeping you alive." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and ominous. Sarah didn't know what he meant, but the fear that had been growing inside her suddenly felt realer than ever. Romano wasn't just protecting her from something. He was keeping her under control, and she didn't know how long she could keep living like this. As the days passed, Sarah began to feel the weight of her situation more heavily. The walls of Romano's mansion were closing in on her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was nothing more than a prisoner in an elegant cage. She had been moved into a luxurious guest room, one of the many in the vast estate. The room was beautifully furnished with expensive furniture, silk curtains, and a king-size bed that felt out of place in her current life. She wasn't used to luxury, and she wasn't used to being treated like this. Romano had given her everything she needed: clothes, food, even personal care. But there was no freedom. She had no say in where she went or who she saw. She spent her days walking the halls of the mansion, always under the watchful eye of his security team. It was like being trapped in a gilded prison. Despite all the comforts, Sarah felt like she was suffocating. Her mind often wandered to her old life, the life she had before Romano appeared. She missed the simple things, walking to the corner store, sitting in the diner for a cup of coffee, or just walking down the street without a pair of watchful eyes following her every move. But those days felt like they belonged to someone else. Romano had made it clear that her safety was his top priority, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just protection. He wasn't just protecting her from something. He was controlling her. She didn't know what his intentions were, but she was beginning to suspect that she was caught in something much larger than herself. Romano hadn't told her much about his life, and she hadn't asked, but she couldn't ignore the fact that his world was one of power, wealth, and danger. Every time she looked into his cold, calculating eyes, she saw a man who had everything, and yet seemed to want more. He had made it clear that he was watching her, that he had a plan for her, but he had never fully explained what that plan was. Every time she tried to question him, he simply smiled and told her to trust him. But trust was a luxury Sarah couldn't afford. She was stuck in this world of shadows, and every time she thought she might escape, the walls seemed to close in even tighter. Romano's presence was always near, and his men were never far from her side. She started to wonder if there was any way out of this, if there was any way she could regain control of her life. One afternoon, as Sarah wandered through the mansion's sprawling garden, she spotted Romano sitting on a bench by a fountain, his eyes focused on the water. He was alone for once, and she saw this as her chance to confront him. She walked over to him, her heart pounding. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice trembling but determined. Romano didn't look up at first. His expression remained unreadable as he gazed at the flowing water. "What do you mean?" he finally replied, his voice calm and collected. "You know exactly what I mean," Sarah said, her frustration rising. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask to be dragged into your world." Romano's eyes finally met hers, and she saw something flicker in them, something that almost looked like regret, but it quickly vanished. "I'm trying to protect you," he said softly, his tone almost gentle. "There are people who would hurt you, Sarah. You don't understand the dangers you're facing. I don't care about your protection." Sarah snapped. "I care about my freedom. I care about my life." Romano leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. "You have freedom, Sarah," he said, his voice dropping lower. "As long as you stay with me, I'll make sure nothing happens to you. But if you try to leave, you'll be putting yourself in danger. And I won't let that happen." His words hit her like a punch to the gut. He wasn't offering her a choice. He was giving her an ultimatum. "You don't get to control my life," Sarah whispered, feeling tears well up in her eyes. Romano reached out and gently cupped her chin, tilting her head up to meet his gaze. "I'm not trying to control you," he said quietly, his voice softer now. "I'm trying to save you. But you have to trust me. You have to understand that I'm the only one who can keep you safe." Sarah pulled away from his touch, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what to believe anymore. She had been so focused on getting out of this situation, but now it felt like there was no way out. She was stuck, and the more she fought, the more it seemed like Romano was always one step ahead. He was right about one thing. She had no idea how deep this went. And as much as she hated to admit it, she was starting to wonder if he was the only one who could protect her from the storm that was coming. As the days went on, Sarah's uncertainty grew deeper. Romano's constant presence, his watchful eyes, and the ever-present security that surrounded her made her feel more like a prisoner than a guest in his world. Each passing day blended into the next, and despite the luxurious surroundings, Sarah began to feel more and more isolated. The mansion, which once seemed like a refuge, now felt like a gilded cage. She spent her days wandering through its many rooms, unsure of what to do with herself, and her nights were restless, filled with uneasy dreams of escape. But no matter how hard she tried to focus on the idea of freedom, her thoughts always came back to Romano, the man who had taken over her life, the man who had promised to protect her, yet still controlled every aspect of her existence. And as much as she hated it, there was a part of her that began to wonder if maybe he was right. Maybe the world he had dragged her into was more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. Maybe his protection was the only thing keeping her alive. Sarah didn't know what to think anymore. She had tried to push back, to resist his control, but each time she did, it felt like she was sinking deeper into his world. One evening, as Sarah sat by the window in her room, watching the dark sky, she heard a soft knock at the door. She had been expecting someone. She had heard footsteps outside her door more than once, but tonight felt different. She stood up slowly and opened the door, only to find Romano standing in the doorway, his usual calm demeanor replaced by something else, something softer. "I thought you might want to talk," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Sarah stepped back, her heart racing. She didn't want to face him, but there was something in his gaze that made her pause. "What is it, Romano?" she asked, her voice colder than she intended. He didn't flinch at the sharpness in her tone. Instead, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. He seemed to be waiting for her to say something, but Sarah didn't know what to say. "I know you don't trust me," he said finally, his voice low, almost apologetic. "And I understand why. But I want you to know that I'm not doing this to hurt you." Sarah turned to face him, her arms crossed. "Then why? Why all of this? Why did you drag me into your world?" Romano's eyes darkened, and for a brief moment, she saw a flicker of something. Anger? Regret? It was gone before she could be sure. "Because you don't understand the danger you're in, Sarah," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "There are people who would hurt you, people you don't even know exist. I'm doing everything I can to protect you. I don't need your protection," Sarah said sharply, though the words felt hollow even as she said them. "I just want my life back. I want to go home." Romano's expression softened, and he took a step closer to her. "I know this isn't easy, but you need to understand, this isn't just about keeping you safe. This is about keeping you alive. And I'm the only one who can do that." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat, and she looked away, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. She didn't want to cry in front of him. She didn't want to show weakness. But the reality of the situation was settling in, and it was hard to deny the truth of his words. She was trapped in a world she didn't understand, and no matter how hard she fought it, she was dependent on him for her survival. Romano's voice broke through her thoughts. "I know it's hard," he said gently, his eyes never leaving hers. "But trust me, Sarah, I won't let anything happen to you. I promise." For a moment, Sarah stood there, staring at him, unsure of what to say. She wanted to tell him to leave, to tell him to let her go, but the words wouldn't come. She didn't know if she could trust him. She didn't know if she ever would. But the fear that had been building inside her was too much to ignore. She was afraid. Afraid of the people who might be after her, afraid of what Romano was involved in, and above all, afraid of being completely alone. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. Romano didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, watching her, his face unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke again. "I don't expect you to trust me right away," he said softly. "But I will earn that trust. And I won't let you down." Sarah swallowed hard, her emotions a whirlwind inside her. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Her life had changed forever. Whether she liked it or not, she was now a part of Romano's world, and the only question was whether she could survive it. Romano gave her one last look before turning to leave. "I'll be nearby," he said. "If you need anything, I'm here." As the door closed behind him, Sarah sat down on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. What had she gotten herself into? And more importantly, how much longer could she stay in this world before she lost herself completely? Days passed in a blur of cold luxury and tense silence. Romano's mansion, once intimidating in its splendor, now felt suffocating to Sarah. She wandered through its lavish rooms, her steps echoing on the marble floors, trying to find a sense of comfort in a place that no longer felt like home. She had everything she could possibly need: fine clothes, gourmet meals, and the security that came with being under Romano's protection. But none of that made up for the one thing she craved: freedom. It was the kind of life most people could only dream of, yet Sarah felt more trapped than ever. The walls of the mansion loomed large, both literally and figuratively, and the guards that followed her everywhere made her feel like a constant prisoner in her own thoughts. She was never alone, never free to do as she pleased. The once promising idea of safety now felt more like a leash. Despite all of this, Sarah's fear of leaving, of walking away from the protection Romano promised, kept her rooted in place. She had tried to resist, to push against his control, but it was clear now that she had no power in this situation. Romano had made it very clear that there were forces after her, dangerous, ruthless people who wouldn't hesitate to hurt her. And the truth was, Sarah had no way of protecting herself from them. She had no allies, no way to fight back. She was just a woman trapped in a world she didn't understand. One evening, as Sarah was sitting in the massive drawing room of the mansion, staring out at the dark, empty lawn, she heard footsteps approaching from behind. She turned to see Romano standing in the doorway, his presence as imposing as ever. There was something different in his eyes tonight. He didn't have his usual air of calm control, and for the first time, Sarah saw something like concern flicker across his face. "I've been watching you," he said, his voice softer than usual. "You're still not adjusting to this life, are you?" Sarah didn't answer at first. She didn't know what to say. She didn't want to admit to him how trapped she felt, how suffocated by this world he had placed her in. "It's not that simple," she said finally, her voice strained. "You've given me everything, but that doesn't mean I'm okay with it. I didn't ask for this life. I didn't ask to be your responsibility." Romano stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "You don't have a choice," he said, his voice low but firm. "You're under my protection, and that means keeping you safe, whether you like it or not." Sarah flinched at his words. "I didn't ask for your protection. I don't want to be a part of this world. I don't want to be controlled." There was a long silence between them. Romano stood still, watching her carefully, as if he was waiting for her to say something else. But she didn't. She didn't know what else to say. The truth was, she felt powerless. She had no control over her own life anymore. And the more she resisted, the more it seemed like Romano's grip on her life tightened. "I didn't ask you to," Romano said quietly. "But that doesn't change the reality of the situation. You're safe with me, Sarah, and you will remain safe. That's the only thing that matters." Sarah wanted to argue, to push back, but she couldn't. She could feel the weight of his words, the weight of the promise he had made to her. He was doing everything to protect her, but at what cost? How long would she have to live like this, under his watchful eye, unable to make her own decisions? She looked at him, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "How long do you expect me to stay here? How long do you expect me to stay under your control?" Romano's gaze softened slightly, but there was still an unshakable firmness in his eyes. "Until you're safe," he said simply. "Until the people who want to hurt you are no longer a threat." Sarah shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "And how long will that take? A week? A month? A year?" Romano didn't answer, and that silence spoke volumes. The truth was, he didn't have an answer. He couldn't promise her when it would end. And deep down, she knew he wasn't just protecting her from others. He was keeping her in this world because he needed her there. She was no longer just a woman he wanted to protect. She was a part of his world now, whether she liked it or not. As the night wore on, Sarah found herself staring at the walls of the mansion, the weight of her situation pressing down on her. There was no escaping this life. There was no going back to the way things were before. Romano was right about one thing. She was safe, for now. But the more she thought about it, the less it felt like safety. It felt like captivity. And the worst part was, she didn't know how much longer she could endure it. Sarah woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. The large four-poster bed that had become her reluctant resting place felt suffocating, as if the very fabric of the sheets was trying to hold her in. She had no idea how long she had been asleep, but the oppressive silence in the mansion made her feel like a prisoner again. The world outside her window was still, shrouded in darkness, but she knew she couldn't stay in this cage of luxury much longer. Each day, the weight of being under Romano's watch grew heavier. Despite the extravagant surroundings, the gilded walls, and the constant luxury, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was constantly being observed. She didn't want to admit it to herself, but she was beginning to feel like she was no longer in control of her own life. The mansion was beautiful, yes, but it also felt like a trap. Romano was always there, always close, always watching. He had promised her safety, but at what cost? Every time she thought she might get a moment to herself, there he was, his dark eyes observing her from a distance. His quiet intensity made her feel like she could never be truly free again. The weight of his words echoed in her mind. Until you're safe, until the people who want to hurt you are no longer a threat. But what if that never happened? What if she was trapped in this life forever, unable to escape his control? She tossed, and turned in the bed, the frustration growing inside her. She had to know more about what was going on, more about why Romano had chosen her, why he was so determined to keep her under his protection. She couldn't just keep living in fear, unsure of what would happen next. Sarah had to find a way to understand what he wanted from her, to understand why he was so invested in keeping her close. She couldn't stand the uncertainty anymore. She needed answers. The thought made her stomach churn, but the fear of the unknown was beginning to overwhelm her. What would happen if she confronted him again? Would he tell her the truth? Or would he shut her down, just like he always did? She had already tried to ask him questions, and each time, he had simply brushed her off, telling her to trust him, to be patient. But patience was wearing thin. She wasn't sure how much longer she could wait for the answers she desperately needed. As Sarah lay there in the dark, staring up at the high ceiling, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Her heart skipped a beat. Romano's men. It had been a few hours since they had last checked in on her, and now, they were moving through the mansion again. Sarah pushed the covers aside and swung her legs over the edge of the bed. She couldn't stand being alone anymore. She had to confront him. She had to take control of her life. She stood up, her bare feet meeting the cold marble floor. The chill in the air seemed to seep into her bones as she walked to the door. She paused for a moment, her hand resting on the doorknob. What if this was a mistake? What if she was making things worse? But she couldn't stay in this prison any longer. She needed to know the truth. She opened the door quietly, careful not to alert the guards who were stationed outside her room. She stepped into the hallway and moved toward the main living area of the mansion. She could hear muffled voices coming from down the hall. Romano was there, speaking to someone in low tones. Sarah's steps were hesitant at first, but her determination kept her moving forward. As she neared the source of the voices, she saw Romano standing in front of a large set of double doors, his back turned to her. His tall, commanding presence filled the room, and Sarah could feel the tension in the air. The moment he turned and saw her standing there, his expression softened, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sarah," he said, his voice calm. "What are you doing out here?" She squared her shoulders and looked him directly in the eye. "I need answers," she said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. Romano sighed, his expression unreadable. "I've told you all you need to know," he said, his tone still soft, but with a hint of impatience. "You're safe, and that's all that matters." But Sarah wasn't satisfied with that answer. "I don't feel safe, Romano," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I feel like a prisoner in my own life. I don't understand why you're doing this, why you're so determined to keep me here." Romano's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't move. "I'm doing this because you don't understand what's at stake, Sarah," he said, his voice low. "You have no idea the danger you're in. I'm protecting you from things you can't even comprehend." Sarah took a step closer, her frustration growing. "I can't live like this anymore. I need to know the truth. I need to understand why I'm here, why you're doing this." For a moment, Romano didn't speak, and the silence between them was thick with unspoken tension. Finally, he sighed and moved closer to her, his presence overwhelming. "You're here because I can't protect you from a distance," he said softly. "You're here because you're more important than you realize. And I'm not going to let anything happen to you." The words hung in the air between them, and for a brief moment, Sarah saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a vulnerability she hadn't noticed before. But it was quickly replaced by the same cold, calculating look he always wore. "I'm not going anywhere," Romano said, his voice steady. "And neither are you." Sarah stared at him, her mind reeling. She had wanted answers, but now, she wasn't sure she was ready for the truth. The reality of her situation was sinking in, and it was more complicated than she had ever imagined. Romano wasn't just protecting her. He was keeping her in this world for a reason that she was still too afraid to uncover. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah found herself slipping deeper into the world that Romano had carefully crafted around her. At first, she had believed that time would heal the tension, that the more she stayed under his protection, the more she would grow accustomed to this new life. But it hadn't worked out that way. The mansion, once a refuge, now felt like a gilded cage. Romano's presence was constant, his watchful eyes following her every move. And though he said he was protecting her, it was becoming harder to ignore the fact that he was also controlling her. The mansion had become a prison, its lavish halls echoing with her footsteps as she wandered aimlessly from room to room. Romano had made sure she had everything she needed: fine clothes, meals that could rival any five-star restaurant, a comfortable bed, and even a personal library with books she had always wanted to read. But none of it mattered. She wanted freedom, and it felt further out of reach every day. Sarah spent most of her days in isolation, her only company the staff and the ever-present security team who watched her like hawks. She had tried to leave the mansion several times, but each time, there was someone waiting for her, subtly guiding her back, reminding her of the dangers outside. The threat that Romano had warned her about, people who would harm her, kept her rooted in place, paralyzed by fear. She had no idea who these people were, or why they wanted to hurt her, but every time she thought about making a run for it, the reality of what might happen if she did came rushing back. One day, as she was sitting by the grand window of the library, gazing out at the sprawling garden that surrounded the mansion, she heard footsteps behind her. Romano's figure appeared in the doorway, his tall, imposing frame casting a shadow in the soft afternoon light. Sarah didn't turn around, instead keeping her eyes on the view outside. "You've been avoiding me," Romano said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of something that almost sounded like concern. "I've been giving you space, but we need to talk." Sarah sighed, her fingers running along the pages of a book she wasn't really reading. "What's there to talk about?" she asked, her voice flat. "I'm here. You're here. I'm stuck. We both know this isn't a life, it's just a waiting game." Romano stepped into the room, his presence filling the space. "This is for your own good, Sarah," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "You're not stuck here because I want to control you. I'm keeping you safe. You have no idea the kind of enemies you have, the kind of people who would kill for the information you unknowingly hold." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, and she finally turned to face him. "What are you talking about? What do I have that anyone would want?" Romano paused, his eyes narrowing as if deciding how much to reveal. "You don't know the full story, Sarah. The people who are after you aren't ordinary criminals. They are powerful, dangerous people who have been looking for someone like you for a long time." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and foreboding. "And what does that have to do with me?" she asked, her voice trembling despite herself. Romano took a step closer, his gaze intense. "You're not just anyone," he said quietly. "You're connected to something much bigger than you realize. And I can't let you go until I'm sure you're safe." Sarah's mind spun. She didn't understand any of it. She had been an ordinary woman, living her life in New York, doing her best to make ends meet. Now, she was trapped in a mansion, under the control of a man who was telling her she was involved in something dangerous, something bigger than herself. "I don't want this," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "I don't want to be a part of your world, Romano. I want to go home. I want to live my life." Romano's eyes softened, but his expression didn't change. "You don't have a home anymore, Sarah," he said, his voice low. "You don't understand the danger that's out there. If you leave, they'll find you. And when they do, it will be too late." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry. She didn't want to believe him, but part of her did. She had seen the men who followed her, the way they watched her every move, the way Romano made sure she was always surrounded by his people. She could feel the tension in the air, the sense that there was something looming just out of reach. "What happens if I stay?" she asked. Quietly. Romano's gaze softened, but only slightly. "You stay because it's the only way to stay alive," he said firmly. "And because you don't have a choice." Sarah felt a wave of frustration rise within her. She was trapped. She had no choice, no control. Her life was no longer her own. The reality of her situation was sinking in deeper, and she could feel the walls closing in around her. She had wanted answers, but the truth she was hearing only made things more confusing. Romano wasn't just protecting her. He was keeping her here for his own reasons, reasons that he wasn't willing to share with her. And that scared her more than anything. The thought of never leaving this place, of being stuck here with no way out, made her want to scream. She was losing herself in this world, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on to who she was. Romano reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle. "I'm not your enemy, Sarah," he said softly. "I'm trying to help you. I'm trying to keep you safe. But you have to trust me." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "I don't know how to trust you," she whispered. "I don't know what's real anymore." Romano's face softened, and for the first time, Sarah saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. I know, he said quietly, and I'll do everything I can to make you feel safe again. But you have to trust me, just a little bit longer. Sarah didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to trust him, or if she ever would. But one thing was clear, her life had changed forever. She was no longer the woman she had been before. She was someone else now. Someone trapped in a world that was as dangerous as it was alluring. The days following their conversation were heavy with silence. Romano kept his distance more than usual, leaving Sarah to her thoughts, and the weight of his words lingered in the air like an unspoken truth. She had tried to push past the anger, the fear, but no matter how much she tried to convince herself she was safe, the reality of her situation was undeniable. The walls of the mansion, once so elegant and serene, now felt like a constant reminder of her confinement. Each corner of the house seemed to watch her, and each day spent under Romano's roof felt like another day lost. She still didn't understand everything. She didn't understand why she was so important to him, why he was so determined to keep her in his world, but what she did understand was that she had no way out. Her life, the one she had once known, was slipping through her fingers. She had thought that with time, things would get better. She had hoped that if she just went along with it, things might go back to normal. But they didn't. They couldn't. The more Sarah tried to pull herself together, the more she realized that her life had become intertwined with Romano's. She couldn't escape the fact that she was now part of a world filled with power and danger, a world that she didn't belong to but couldn't seem to leave. One evening, as the sun set behind the mansion, casting long shadows over the garden, Sarah found herself wandering outside, needing air to clear her head. The estate was vast, the garden sprawling out in front of her like a maze of hedges and fountains. She walked slowly, feeling the cool evening breeze on her skin, but it didn't offer any relief. Her mind was still trapped in the chaos of the past few days. As she reached the edge of the garden, she stopped by a fountain, the sound of running water only adding to the tension she felt. She needed answers. She needed to know what was going on, what Romano was keeping from her. As if on cue, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned quickly, but it wasn't Romano who had followed her this time. It was one of his men. He was tall, with short dark hair and a serious expression. He stood a few feet away, watching her carefully. "Mr. Romano asked me to check on you," he said in a low voice. "Is everything all right?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She didn't want to talk to anyone, especially not one of Romano's men. "I'm fine," she replied curtly, trying to hide the frustration in her voice. The man didn't seem to take the hint. "If you need anything, Miss Anderson, please let me know," he said, his tone formal. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to say anything else. She turned away, hoping he would take the hint and leave, but as she walked back toward the house, she could feel his gaze on her. The sense of being watched was never far behind. Later that evening, as she sat alone in the parlor, Romano entered the room. His presence filled the space, and for a moment, Sarah couldn't speak. She had so many questions, but every time she tried to ask him something, he avoided her gaze, deflecting the topic with vague assurances that everything was fine. "You've been quiet tonight," Romano said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "I've given you the space you asked for, but I need to know you're okay." Sarah looked up at him, her frustration rising. "How can I be okay?" she asked, her voice shaking with barely contained emotion. "I'm stuck here, in this mansion, with no idea what's going on, and you won't even tell me the truth." Romano's eyes darkened slightly, but he didn't seem angry. Instead, there was something almost sad in his expression. "I'm doing what I think is best for you, Sarah," he said quietly. "You don't understand the danger you're in. You don't understand how far these people will go." Sarah clenched her fists, trying to control the anger bubbling inside her. "Then tell me, why am I here? What do they want from me? Why do you care so much?" Romano didn't answer right away. He seemed to hesitate, as if weighing his words carefully. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I'm trying to protect you, Sarah. There are people who would stop at nothing to get to you, and I can't let that happen. You don't know how much you mean to me, how important you are to everything." Sarah stared at him, feeling a mix of anger and confusion. "What do you mean? What am I to you? Why does this matter so much?" Romano's expression softened, and for the first time, Sarah saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. I've been watching over you for a long time, Sarah, he said quietly. And I can't let you slip away. You're connected to something bigger than either of us, and I need to keep you safe. For both our sakes. Sarah's mind spun. Connected to something bigger? What did that even mean? She opened her mouth to ask more questions, but before she could, Romano stood up and turned toward the door. I'll make sure you're safe, he said, his voice firm again. But you need to trust me. Please, just trust me. As he walked out, Sarah was left in the silence of the room, her heart racing. The questions still lingered, unanswered, and the truth she was seeking seemed farther out of reach than ever. What did Romano really want from her? What was the danger that he kept alluding to? And most importantly, how much longer could she live in this prison of luxury before she lost herself completely? The days following their conversation were heavy with tension. Sarah spent her time wandering through the mansion, trying to grasp the reality of her situation. Romano's words echoed in her mind. You don't understand how important you are. The weight of that statement hung over her like a dark cloud. She had never considered herself special or important. She had lived a simple life, working at a diner, going home to a small apartment every night. Now, everything had changed, and she couldn't make sense of it. Romano had told her to trust him, but trust felt like a fragile thing. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she knew very little about the man who had taken control of her life. She knew his name, but she didn't know his past. She didn't know what had led him to create the world of power, secrecy, and danger that surrounded them both. The mansion felt colder than ever, the walls pressing in as Sarah tried to make sense of her feelings. She couldn't ignore the fact that Romano had saved her from something, from someone. She didn't know who or what, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was being manipulated by someone who held all the cards. A week passed without much change. Romano still kept his distance, though he watched her more closely than ever. She could feel his eyes on her whenever they were in the same room, his presence always looming just outside her reach. He had promised to keep her safe, but his protection came at a price. The thought of leaving crossed her mind more than once, but she always stopped herself. What would happen if she tried to leave? Would the threats he had warned her about come true? She didn't know who to trust, and she didn't know what kind of world Romano had brought her into. One evening, as Sarah sat by the fire in the large drawing room, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to see Romano entering the room, his usual calm demeanor replaced with something else. His face was harder than usual, his jaw set, and Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. We need to talk, he said, his voice low. Sarah stood up, suddenly feeling on edge. What about? She asked, trying to keep the fear from her voice. Romano's eyes softened for a moment before he answered. It's time you knew the truth. The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. The truth? She had been waiting for him to explain everything, but hearing him say it out loud made the situation feel even more real. What truth? She asked, her voice trembling. Romano took a deep breath before speaking again. You're not just here because I want to protect you, he said, his voice almost apologetic. You're here because you're tied to something much bigger than you know. Something dangerous. Sarah's heart began to race. What was he talking about? What did she have to do with anything dangerous? What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Romano's expression hardened, and he took a step closer. You have something they want, he said, his voice low. Something powerful, and they'll stop at nothing to get it. Sarah took a step back, her mind racing. What is it? What do I have? Romano didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his back to her, pacing slightly as if choosing his words carefully. You were meant to inherit something, he said quietly, as though speaking more to himself than to her. A legacy, a connection, that has been kept from you. And now, because of that, you're a target. Sarah's head was spinning. Inherited something? A legacy? She didn't have any family left, no inheritance, no connections to anything that could be of importance. I don't understand, she said, her voice cracking with frustration. I'm just an ordinary woman. I have nothing. Romano turned to face her, his eyes intense. That's the problem, Sarah, he said softly. You don't know who you really are. Sarah felt a chill run through her body. Who I am, she repeated, barely able to comprehend what he was saying. What are you talking about? Romano stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. You were born into something, a world of power that's been hidden from you. And now that it's starting to come to light, there are people who want to control it. and they want you to be a part of it. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. I don't belong in any of this, she said, her voice rising with panic. This isn't my world, Romano. I don't know anything about it. Romano's expression softened again, and for the first time, Sarah saw a flicker of sympathy in his eyes. I know it's a lot to take in, he said gently, but I can't let them have you. I can't let them take what's yours. That's why I'm doing this, Sarah. To protect you. Sarah felt her knees weaken, and she sank back into the armchair, trying to process everything he had just said. She had always considered herself an ordinary person with a simple life. And yet here she was, caught in a dangerous game she didn't understand, with a man who seemed to hold all the answers but was keeping them hidden. I didn't ask for any of this, she whispered, her mind spinning. Romano sat down across from her, his gaze still intense. I know you didn't. But sometimes, Sarah, life doesn't give us a choice. The weight of his words settled on her like a heavy blanket. She didn't know how much longer she could live in this world of uncertainty, surrounded by secrets and lies. But what scared her the most was the growing realization that Romano might be the only person who could protect her, and that meant she had no choice but to trust him, whether she wanted to or not. The days after their conversation seemed to drag on endlessly. Sarah tried to come to terms with what Romano had told her, but the more she thought about it, the less sense it made. How could she have been born into something so powerful, so dangerous, when all she had ever known was a life of simple, hard work? It was almost too much to bear. She spent her days alone in the mansion, wandering from room to room, trying to quiet the chaos in her mind. The once comforting silence of the mansion now felt like an oppressive weight. Each time she passed a mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. She had gone from a waitress in a small diner to someone caught in the tangled web of power and danger. Her life had been turned upside down by a man who seemed to have all the answers, but kept them locked behind an impenetrable wall of mystery. Romano continued to keep his distance, but his presence was always felt. He made sure she had everything she needed, and he never hesitated to remind her that she was under his protection. But protection felt like a cage, and every day that passed made her feel more and more trapped. One afternoon, Sarah decided she couldn't take it anymore. She needed to confront him, to demand answers once and for all. She couldn't live in this constant state of uncertainty. She had to know the truth. Sarah made her way to his office, the one place in the mansion that she had never ventured into. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear the faint sound of papers rustling inside. She didn't knock. Instead, she pushed the door open and walked in. Romano looked up from his desk, surprised to see her standing there. He didn't immediately speak, but his eyes seemed to weigh her, as if assessing her intention. Sarah felt a mix of fear and determination. She wasn't going to leave until she got the answers she had been searching for. What do you want from me? She demanded, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. Romano didn't respond right away. He stood up from his desk, his imposing figure filling the room. For a moment, Sarah thought he might try to brush her off, but instead, he walked around the desk and stopped in front of her. You still don't understand, do you? He said softly, his tone almost sympathetic. You're part of something bigger than you know. Something that's been in the works for a long time. I don't care about that. Sarah shot back, frustration bubbling over. All I care about is why I'm here, why you're keeping me here, and what it is you want from me. Romano sighed, his eyes softening, but only slightly. I'm keeping you here because I have to, he said quietly. There are people who would use you, hurt you, because of your connection to all of this. I'm trying to protect you from that. Sarah took a step back, her mind reeling. What connection? What do I have to do with any of this? She asked, her voice shaky. Romano paused for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. Then, finally, he spoke. Your father, he said quietly. Your father was involved in something powerful. He worked with people who are dangerous, and you, by blood, are connected to that world. Sarah's heart seemed to stop for a moment. Her father? She barely remembered him. He had left when she was young, and the memories she had of him were faint, just fragments. But what was he involved in? And how did it affect her? I don't understand, she whispered, her voice barely audible. What are you saying? My father was part of this. Romano nodded slowly. Yes, he was. And that's why you're in danger. The people he worked with are still out there, and they know about you. They know who you are, and they will stop at nothing to use you for their own gain. Sarah shook her head, struggling to process what he was saying. But I don't know anything about this. I didn't ask for any of it, she cried. Romano stepped closer to her, his expression softening. I know, Sarah. But now, you're caught in the middle of it all. And I can't let them have you. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For the first time, Sarah felt like she was beginning to understand, at least a little bit. But it was still too much. Her father, a man she barely remembered, had somehow tied her to a dangerous world she knew nothing about. And now she was a target. So what now? She asked, her voice shaking. Romano placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture that should have been comforting, but instead, it felt like a chain being wrapped around her even tighter. Now, you stay with me, he said firmly. You stay safe. You don't have a choice. And when this is over, when the danger has passed, I'll let you go. Sarah wanted to argue, to demand her freedom, but something in Romano's. I stopped her. She saw the determination there, the seriousness in his expression. He wasn't going to let her go, not until whatever this was finished. And in that moment, Sarah realized the truth. She wasn't just trapped by the people who were after her, but by Romano himself. She was caught between two worlds, one that wanted to use her and one that was keeping her captive. She didn't know how this would end, but she knew one thing for sure. Her life would never be the same again. Days passed, and Sarah felt herself being drawn deeper into the world that Romano had carefully crafted around her. Every moment spent in the mansion felt like a fragile balancing act, each step weighed down by the uncertainty of her future. She had learned more about her father's involvement in this dangerous world, but the details remained hazy. Romano had given her only snippets of the truth, just enough to keep her on edge, never enough to understand the full scope of the danger she was in. Despite his assurances that he was protecting her, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that he was keeping her in the dark on purpose. She still didn't know who these people were, the ones Romano had claimed were after her, and she couldn't help but feel like she was slowly being swallowed by this world she hadn't asked to be a part of. Romano continued to keep her close, though his presence seemed more distant lately. He had kept his word. She was safe, at least for now. But what kind of safety was this? She was living in a mansion with no control over her own life, surrounded by people who were only there to watch her, to keep her under control. The isolation was wearing on her, the constant pressure to stay within the confines of the mansion weighing on her every day. It was becoming harder to ignore the fear that had taken root in her chest. One night, as Sarah sat alone in the dimly lit drawing room, she heard the faint sound of a door opening. She turned toward the sound, expecting it to be one of Romano's men, but instead, it was him, Romano. He stood in the doorway, his tall frame casting a shadow across the room. For a moment, he didn't speak, just watched her silently. She couldn't read the expression on his face, but something about his presence made her feel uneasy. Sarah, he finally said, his voice soft, almost tentative. We need to talk. She didn't respond at first, her eyes locked on his. How many times had they had this conversation? How many times had he told her they needed to talk, only to brush off her questions or give her vague answers? About what? She asked, her voice laced with frustration. Romano stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. About what comes next, he said, his eyes steady. I've been keeping you here to protect you, but things are starting to move. The people after you are getting closer, and we don't have much time. Sarah's heart began to race, and she stood up, feeling a sense of urgency building within her. What do you mean, things are starting to move? She demanded. Who are these people? What do they want with me? Romano's gaze darkened slightly, his expression becoming more serious. I can't explain everything yet, he said, his voice tight. But you're not safe here anymore. We have to move you. The words hit her like a punch. Move her? Where? She couldn't stay in the mansion forever, but the thought of leaving, of stepping into a world she didn't understand, terrified her. Where are we going? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Somewhere safe, Romano replied, his voice firm but reassuring. I have a place we can go, a place where you'll be protected. But we have to leave now. No more waiting. Sarah took a step back, her mind spinning. Why now? Why not before? She asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. Romano's eyes softened, but only slightly. Because I couldn't risk it before, he said. You weren't ready. But now, with everything that's happening, we don't have a choice. Sarah felt a pang of unease. It was all happening too quickly, and she wasn't sure she was ready for whatever was coming. But she couldn't stay here, not with the constant threat hanging over her head. Okay, she said, her voice small. Let's go. Romano nodded, his expression still unreadable. I'll have everything packed. We leave tonight. As Romano walked out of the room, Sarah stood still for a moment, trying to wrap her mind around what was happening. She didn't know where they were going, or what dangers awaited her, but she knew one thing. She couldn't stay here any longer. The walls of the mansion, once a symbol of safety, now felt like a trap. Romano was offering her an escape, but at what cost? She didn't know what was waiting for her, but she had no choice but to follow him. It was the only option she had. As she prepared to leave, Sarah's mind raced. What was the real reason Romano had kept her here for so long? What was he hiding from her? And most importantly, what would she find when she stepped into the world beyond the mansion walls? She didn't know the answers, but she knew she was about to find out. The door to the mansion closed behind her, and as the car sped away into the night, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change forever. And whether she was ready or not, she was being dragged deeper into a world she couldn't escape. The car sped through the dark streets, the tires humming softly against the road as Sarah sat in silence beside Romano. The night air outside felt cold, but inside the car, the tension between them was palpable. She still couldn't process everything he had said, everything he had done. He had told her they were going somewhere safe, somewhere they could escape the danger that had been closing in on her, but the weight of the unknown pressed down on her chest. Romano glanced over at her, his gaze steady but unreadable. You're doing the right thing, he said softly, breaking the silence. Sarah didn't respond at first. She wasn't sure what the right thing was anymore. It felt like she was being dragged deeper into a world she had no control over, a world where secrets were kept from her, where her life was no longer hers to live. I know you don't understand everything, Romano continued, his voice softer now. But trust me, this is the only way to keep you safe. Sarah turned her head to look out the window, watching the passing streetlights blur into streaks of yellow and white. She had wanted to believe him, to trust him, but something inside her resisted. The more she tried to make sense of it all, the more she realized how little she actually knew. Romano had promised to protect her, but what if he was the one who was keeping her locked away, controlling her every move? She felt trapped, caught in a web she couldn't untangle. I don't know if I can trust you, she whispered, almost to herself. Romano didn't answer at first. His silence only made her more uncertain. Was he truly trying to protect her, or was there something more sinister at play? As the car continued through the city, Sarah's mind raced. The mansion, the men who had followed her everywhere, the constant surveillance. It all felt like she was being suffocated. Romano had kept her safe, but at what cost? How much longer could she live like this? As if reading her thoughts, Romano spoke again, his voice a little more firm. You don't have to worry about them anymore, he said. The people who wanted you gone, they're not a threat anymore. Sarah turned to look at him, her brow furrowing. What do you mean? She asked, her voice tight. How do you know they're not still out there? Romano's expression hardened slightly, his jaw clenched. I've taken care of it, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. You're safe. I've made sure of it. Sarah's mind reeled at his words. How could he have taken care of it? What did he mean by that? Had he really kept her safe, or was there something darker behind his actions? She wanted to ask him more, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she leaned back in her seat, her thoughts spiraling. The car eventually pulled into a secluded area, a small, private estate surrounded by tall trees and high walls. Romano's men opened the gates, and the car drove inside. Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as they stopped in front of a grand, isolated house. It was beautiful, but it felt too much like a prison. Romano stepped out first, and one of his men opened the door for Sarah. Come on, Romano said, his voice gentle but firm. We're here. You'll be safe here. Sarah hesitated for a moment, looking at the house, and then at Romano. She had no choice. She couldn't stay in the car, couldn't go back to the mansion. She had no idea where this place was, but it seemed like the only option she had left. She stepped out of the car, her heart heavy with uncertainty. The security around the estate was tight, and Romano's men stood at attention, watching her every move. It was clear that this was no ordinary place. The mansion, though beautiful, was fortified, and she couldn't help but feel the weight of its isolation. Romano led her inside, his presence commanding. "This is your new home," he said as they walked through the grand foyer. "You're safe here. No one can reach you." Sarah tried to make sense of what he was saying, but her mind was too clouded with confusion. She felt like she was losing herself in this new world, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could take it. The house was luxurious, but the cold, sterile atmosphere only added to her unease. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being controlled, that everything she did was being watched. "I don't want this," she finally said, her voice breaking through the silence. "I don't want to be here, Romano. I don't want to live in a world where I'm always looking over my shoulder, always afraid of what's coming next." Romano stopped walking, turning to face her. His expression softened, but there was still a hardness in his eyes. "You don't have a choice," he said gently. "But you're safe. That's all that matters." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. She wasn't sure what to believe anymore. She didn't know if she could keep living in this world of secrets, control, and uncertainty. She had wanted to escape, to find freedom, but it seemed like that was no longer an option. She was stuck, and the truth was, she wasn't sure she could trust anyone, not even Romano. She had been pulled into something much bigger than herself, something she couldn't escape. And no matter how much she fought, she couldn't outrun the world he had dragged her into. Romano was right about one thing. She was safe. But that safety came at a price. And now, she wasn't sure if the price was worth it. In this gripping tale of dark romance, Sarah finds herself trapped in a world that she never chose, surrounded by danger, mystery, and a powerful man who claims to protect her. Romano, a man shrouded in secrets, offers her safety, but at what cost? As Sarah struggles to understand her new life, she uncovers startling truths about her family and her connection to a dangerous world she didn't know existed. The deeper she gets pulled into this dark romance, the more she realizes that escape is impossible. As she is forced to confront her feelings for Romano, the line between protector and captor blurs, and Sarah's journey into a world of power, control, and dark desires becomes inevitable. Romano's dark, controlling presence in her life makes her question everything she thought she knew about love, trust, and survival. With each passing day, she finds herself caught in a web of power, deception, and dangerous emotions, all while battling the growing attraction she feels for the man who holds her life in his hands. This dark romance is filled with twists, mystery, and intense emotions, leaving Sarah torn between her need for freedom and her unexpected feelings for Romano. The dangers that await her in this dark romance are far from over, and Sarah must decide if she can trust the man who has promised to protect her, or if he is the one she needs to escape from before it's too late.